The fluorescent lights in the oncology ward cast everything in a harsh, clinical glow that made even healthy people look pale. I sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, the IV drip slowly delivering chemotherapy into my arm, and stared at the empty chair beside me where my husband should have been. 3 hours. That's how long David had lasted before mumbling something about needing to, quote, handle some urgent work calls, and disappearing down the hallway. I'd watched him go, his shoulders tense, with what I now recognized wasn't stress about work, it was revulsion. Revulsion at seeing his wife of 12 years reduced to this, bald, gaunt, and fighting for her life at 34. "Mrs. Patterson?" The nurse, Maria, appeared beside me with her usual gentle smile. "How are you feeling? Any nausea?" "I'm fine," I lied, just like I'd been lying to everyone about how fine I was for months. Fine when David stopped touching me after my mastectomy. Fine when he started working late every night. Fine when he began talking about me in the past tense, as if I was already gone. "Gloria." Maria checked my vitals and adjusted the drip. "Your husband stepped out?" "Work emergency," I said, the familiar excuse sliding easily off my tongue. She nodded, but I caught the look in her eyes. The nurses had seen this before. The spouses who couldn't handle the reality of cancer, who gradually withdrew until they were physically present but emotionally absent. Some disappeared entirely. "Who with tha?" I closed my eyes and tried to focus on the meditation techniques Dr. Reeves had taught me. Breathe in strength, breathe out fear. But today, fear was winning. Not fear of the cancer. I'd made peace with that fight months ago. Fear of facing it alone. That's when I heard the commotion in the hallway. "Excuse me, sir, you can't just walk through here without—" "I'm looking for Sarah Patterson. I'm her doctor." My eyes snapped open. That voice was familiar. But it wasn't Dr. Morrison, my oncologist. I turned toward the entrance to the treatment area just as a small army of people in white coats swept through the doors. Dr. James Reeves led the group, his tall frame and silver hair unmistakable even from a distance. Behind him were Dr. Sarah Kim, the brilliant researcher who'd been working on my case, Dr. Michael Torres from the surgical team, and 3 other specialists I recognized from consultations. They moved with purpose, scanning the room until Dr. Reeves spotted me. "Sarah!" Dr. Reeves called out, his usually reserved demeanor replaced by something approaching excitement. The entire treatment ward turned to look as the medical team approached my chair. "Dr. Reeves," I sat up straighter, confused. "What's going on? Is something wrong?" He pulled up a chair, and the other doctors gathered around. "Sarah, we need to talk to you about your latest test results. The experimental treatment protocol you've been participating in. The immunotherapy trial? I'd enrolled 3 months ago when conventional treatments hadn't been enough." "Yes. Sarah, your tumors have shrunk by 87%. The words hit me like a physical blow. I stared at him, certain I'd misheard. "What?" Dr. Kim stepped forward, her eyes bright with tears. "Sarah, we've never seen results like this. The combination of treatments is working beyond our wildest projections. You're not just responding, you're going into remission." The treatment ward had gone completely silent. Other patients and their families were staring, some smiling through their own tears at witnessing this moment. Maria, my nurse, had her hand pressed to her mouth. "I don't understand," I whispered. "Are you saying—" "We're saying you're going to live," Dr. Reeves said simply. "Not just live, Sarah. Based on these results, we believe you're going to live a long, healthy life." That's when I heard another commotion from the hallway. David's voice, irritated and entitled, "Look, I just stepped out for a few minutes. My wife is in treatment. You can't tell me I can't go back to—" He appeared in the doorway and froze. His eyes took in the scene. Me surrounded by what looked like half the hospital's medical staff, all of them beaming, several wiping away tears. His face went through a series of expressions: confusion, calculation, and then something that made my stomach turn: relief. Not relief that I was going to live, but relief that he wouldn't have to be the guy whose wife died of cancer. "Faye, what's going on?" David asked, walking over with that forced smile he'd perfected for public appearances. Dr. Reeves stood up. And I could see him taking in David's expensive suit, his perfect hair, the absence of any sign that he'd been sitting in a cancer ward supporting his wife. "You must be Sarah's husband. I'm Dr. Reeves. I was just giving Sarah some extraordinary news about her recovery." David's smile became more genuine as the implications sank in. "Recovery? You mean—" "She's going to be fine," Dr. Torres said, but his tone was notably cool. Medical professionals were good at reading people, and they'd clearly read David correctly. "That's incredible." David moved toward me, arms outstretched as if to embrace me. "Honey, this is amazing news. I knew you'd beat this. I never doubted." "Where were you?" I asked quietly. David stopped mid-stride. "What? Where were you when they came to tell me I'm going to live?" I looked at my husband, really looked at him, and saw him clearly for perhaps the first time in months. "I've been sitting here for 3 hours, alone, getting chemotherapy, and you were nowhere to be found." "I told you, I had work." "You've had work every day for 4 months, I said, my voice getting stronger. "You've had work for every treatment, every doctor's appointment, every night I was too sick to sleep." The medical team was beginning to look uncomfortable, realizing they'd walked into something more complex than delivering good news. Dr. Reeves cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should give you some privacy too." "No," I said, not taking my eyes off David. "They should stay. They're the ones who've been here for me." David's face was cycling through emotions: embarrassment at being called out in front of strangers, anger at being made to look bad, and something that might have been shame if he was capable of it. "Sarah, you're being dramatic. I've been here for you throughout this whole thing. You've been here physically," I said, "when it was convenient, when it didn't interfere with your work or your comfort or your image of yourself as a good husband. But you haven't been here." I gestured to the space around us, not where it mattered. Maria, who had been quietly observing, stepped forward. "Mrs. Patterson, would you like me to call someone to pick you up when your treatment is finished?" The question hung in the air. David's face went pale as he realized what she was really asking, whether his wife needed someone other than him to take care of her. "I can take her home," David said quickly. "I'm her husband." I looked at this man I'd been married to for 12 years, this man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health, and felt something shift inside me. Maybe it was the drugs, or maybe it was the overwhelming relief of learning I was going to live, but suddenly I could see our marriage with perfect clarity. "Maria," I said, still looking at David, "could you call my sister Janet? Tell her I have news to share and ask if she can pick me up." David's face went through one final transformation, from confusion to understanding, to something approaching panic. He was realizing that surviving cancer meant I might also survive our marriage, and that I might choose not to. "Sarah," he started, but I held up my hand. "Dr. Reeves," I said, turning to the man who'd just given me my life back, "how long do I need to continue treatment?" "We'll want to monitor you closely for the next 6 months, he said carefully. "But the intensive treatments can probably be reduced significantly." I nodded. "And I'll be able to work? To travel? To live independently?" "Sarah, what are you?" David began. "Yes," Dr. Reeves said, his eyes kind but knowing. "You'll be able to do anything you want to do." I smiled for the first time in months. Really smiled. "Then I think I'm going to be just fine." As the medical team began to disperse, each stopping to squeeze my hand or congratulate me again, David remained standing awkwardly beside my chair. The face that had looked so relieved minutes ago now looked stricken. "Honey," he said quietly, "we should talk about this at home." "We should," I agreed. "But, David, when we do talk, you should know that cancer taught me something important about what I can survive. And it turns out I can survive a lot more than I thought I could." His face told me he understood exactly what I meant. 3 hours later, Janet arrived to find me finishing my treatment with a smile on my face and divorce papers being drafted in my head. As we walked toward the exit, I passed David in the parking lot, sitting in his car, staring at the cancer center with an expression of complete bewilderment. He'd thought cancer would take me away from him. He never imagined it would give me the strength to walk away myself. But sometimes the best treatment for what's killing you is learning that you're strong enough to live without it. But sometimes the best treatment for what's killing you is learning that you're strong enough to live without it. Mootana, Lazayatazrable, the divorce papers were filed 3 weeks later. I sat in my attorney's office, a woman named Catherine Walsh, who specialized in cases involving medical crises and marital breakdown. She'd seen enough situations like mine to know exactly what we were dealing with. In cases where one spouse abandons the other during serious illness, the courts tend to be quite sympathetic, Catherine explained, reviewing the documents I'd brought. Your medical records clearly show the timeline of your treatment, and we have witness statements from your medical team about your husband's absence during critical periods. Dr. Reeves had been reluctant to get involved in personal matters, but when I explained that David was now claiming he'd been my primary caregiver throughout my illness, the entire medical team had stepped forward. Apparently, David's disappearing acts hadn't gone unnoticed by the nursing staff, who kept detailed records of patient support systems. He's demanding half of everything, I said, sliding another document across her desk, including my inheritance from my grandmother, which paid for most of my medical treatments. Catherine's eyebrows rose. The inheritance you used for cancer treatment while he was handling work emergencies? The same. She made a note. We'll be challenging that aggressively. In California, dissipation of marital assets includes using joint funds for medical expenses, while the other spouse fails to contribute emotionally or financially to the crisis. The legal process was surprisingly cathartic. For months, I'd felt powerless. Cancer had taken my health, my hair, my energy, and my husband's respect. But in the courtroom, I finally had agency again. I could fight back. David, predictably, was not handling the divorce well. He'd started with denial, showing up at Janet's house where I was staying during recovery, carrying flowers and wearing the concerned husband act he'd perfected for our friends. Sarah, you're not thinking clearly, he'd said, standing on Janet's porch while I watched from the living room window. The cancer treatment has you confused. We can work through this. Janet, who was 5 years older than me and had never particularly liked David, had handled that conversation with surgical precision. David, she has cancer, not brain damage, I heard her say through the door. Her thinking is perfectly clear. Clearer than it's been in years, actually. When denial failed, he moved to bargaining. Text messages flooded my phone, promises to be a better husband, suggestions for couples therapy, offers to take time off work to focus on us. Each message revealed how fundamentally he misunderstood what had happened between us. He thought this was about him not being perfect during my illness. He didn't realize it was about him revealing exactly who he was when I needed him most. The anger phase came when his lawyer informed him that California's community property laws wouldn't protect him from the consequences of his behavior during my medical crisis. Suddenly, my phone filled with different kinds of messages. Accusations that I was being vindictive. Claims that he'd, quote, sacrificed everything from my medical care. Threats that he'd fight for every penny. That's when Catherine had suggested we compile a more detailed record of David's, quote, sacrifices. The evidence was devastating, even to me. Credit card records showed that while I was undergoing chemotherapy, David had spent thousands of dollars on lunches, golf games, and weekend trips with friends. His calendar, which his lawyer was required to produce, revealed a pattern of scheduling important meetings and social events during my treatment appointments. Most damning was the discovery of his search history from my laptop, searches for life insurance payouts, widower support groups, and, horrifyingly, how soon can you remarry after spouse dies? Sarah, Catherine said during one of our meetings, I've handled a lot of divorce cases, including some truly ugly ones, but I've never seen someone so thoroughly document their own abandonment of a seriously ill spouse. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for a rainy Tuesday in November, exactly 6 months after my miraculous recovery news. By then, my hair had grown back into a short, silver-streaked style that made me look older but somehow more myself. I'd gained back 20 pounds and was working part-time at a nonprofit that supported cancer patients, a job that had emerged from my own experience navigating the system. David arrived at the courthouse with his lawyer, a expensive-suited man who looked like he charged by the minute. I watched David scan the hallway, clearly expecting to see me looking fragile and uncertain, ready to cave under legal pressure. Instead, he found me sitting calmly with Catherine, reviewing documents and laughing at something she'd said. I was wearing a burgundy dress that had been too big for me during treatment, but now fit perfectly, and the confidence I'd rebuilt over the months of recovery was visible in my posture. His face went through that familiar cycle of expressions. Confusion, then calculation, then a kind of panic. "Sarah," he approached our table, his lawyer trailing behind. You look really good." "I feel really good," I said simply. "Listen, we don't have to do this. We could still work things out. I know I wasn't perfect during your illness, but—" "David," I interrupted gently, "you weren't imperfect. You were absent. There's a difference." The hearing itself was brief but brutal. Catherine had prepared a timeline that laid out David's behavior alongside my medical records. The judge, a woman in her 60s who had clearly seen her share of human weakness, listened with increasingly apparent distaste as the pattern emerged. "Mr. Patterson," Judge Martinez said when David's lawyer finished his arguments about community property and his client's emotional distress, "I'm looking at evidence that while your wife was undergoing life-threatening treatment, you were consistently absent from medical appointments, failed to provide emotional support, and actually increased your personal spending on recreational activities. Is that accurate?" David's lawyer started to respond, but the judge held up her hand. "I'm asking Mr. Patterson directly." David stood up, and for a moment I saw a flash of the man I'd married. Someone who could be charming and persuasive when he needed to be. "Your Honor, I was dealing with enormous stress. My wife's illness was devastating for our entire family, and I was trying to maintain some normalcy by going golfing during her chemotherapy sessions." The courtroom was silent. David's face flushed red. There were days when I needed to clear my head." Judge Martinez looked at him for a long moment, then at the evidence spread across her desk. "Mr. Patterson, in 30 years on this bench, I have seen people behave badly during marriage dissolution. I have rarely seen someone behave as poorly during their spouse's medical crisis as these records indicate you did. She granted me everything I'd asked for, and then some. The house, my inheritance money, my retirement accounts, and spousal support that would last until I was fully back on my feet professionally." David walked out of that courthouse with his legal fees, his car, and the bitter knowledge that his abandonment had cost him everything. But my real recovery was just beginning. The divorce was finalized 2 months later, on a bright January morning that felt like the start of something new. I celebrated by doing something I'd been planning since my first clear scan. I booked a trip to Italy. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Janet asked as she drove me to the airport. "Traveling alone, so soon after everything?" I looked out the car window at the California landscape rushing past and felt something I hadn't experienced in over a year. Pure excitement. "I've never been more ready for anything in my life," I said. The trip was supposed to be 2 weeks. I stayed for 6. Florence became my base, but I wandered through Tuscany and down to Rome, then north to the lakes. I ate pasta without worrying about my weight, walked for hours without thinking about my energy levels, and talked to strangers in broken Italian without caring how I looked. Most importantly, I remembered who I was beyond being a cancer patient or a disappointed wife. In a small town outside of Siena, I met Marco, a widowed historian who was restoring a medieval church. We struck up a conversation in a cafe, and he invited me to see his work. The church was beautiful in its partial restoration, some walls gleaming with new frescoes, others still bearing the scars of centuries. "It is like life, no?" Marco said as we stood in the nave, sunlight streaming through ancient windows. "Some parts we can make beautiful again. Other parts, we leave the damage visible because it tells the story of survival." I touched one of the walls where bullet holes from World War II were still visible, incorporated into the church's restoration rather than hidden. "The scars make it stronger," I said. "Exactly." When I returned to California in early summer, I was not the same person who had left. The cancer survivor who had timidly filed for divorce had been replaced by a woman who knew exactly what she wanted from the rest of her life. I quit my old job in marketing and took a full-time position at the cancer support nonprofit. Within a year, I was running their patient advocacy program, helping other people navigate the medical and emotional challenges I'd experienced firsthand. The work brought me into contact with Dr. Reeves again, whose research had continued to break new ground in immunotherapy. Our professional relationship gradually became a friendship, built on shared commitment to helping cancer patients and their families. "You know," he said one day, as we reviewed a new support program proposal, "you've become one of our most effective advocates. Patients trust you in a way they don't always trust medical professionals." "Because I've been where they are," I said. "I know what it feels like to be afraid, to feel abandoned, to wonder if you'll ever feel normal again." And now? I considered the question. A year and a half after my diagnosis, 18 months since David had walked out of my chemotherapy session, 6 months since our divorce was finalized, I was sitting in a job I loved, planning another trip to Italy, and genuinely excited about my future. "Now I know that feeling normal again isn't the goal," I said. "The goal is feeling like yourself again. And sometimes yourself turns out to be stronger and more independent than you ever imagined." That strength was tested when David reappeared in my life the following spring. I was at a charity gala for the Cancer Center, representing the nonprofit and celebrating another successful year of patient support programs. I just finished giving a speech about the importance of comprehensive care that addressed emotional and social needs alongside medical treatment when I felt a familiar presence behind me. "Sarah?" I turned to find David in a tuxedo, looking exactly like the successful businessman he'd always been. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, younger, blonde, wearing an expression of poorly concealed curiosity. "David," I said evenly, "I didn't expect to see you here. I heard you were speaking tonight. I thought maybe we could talk." The woman beside him shifted uncomfortably. I realized she was probably the reason for his sudden interest in reconnecting. Perhaps she'd asked questions about his ex-wife, or maybe he was feeling the need to clean up his reputation. "I don't think we have much to talk about," I said, but not unkindly. "Sarah, I've been thinking a lot about everything that happened, about how I handled your illness. I know I made mistakes." "David," I interrupted gently, "you didn't make mistakes. You made choices. Every single day, you chose to prioritize your comfort over my needs. You chose your fear over my courage. You chose to withdraw instead of stepping forward." His companion was looking increasingly uncomfortable as she began to understand what conversation she was witnessing. "I was scared," David said, his voice dropping. "I was terrified of losing you, and I didn't know how to handle it. I looked at this man I'd spent 12 years with, this man who'd promised to love me in sickness and in health, and felt something unexpected. Pity. David, everyone was scared. I was scared. My family was scared. My medical team dealt with life and death every day, and they were scared for me. But they all found ways to turn that fear into support. You turned it into abandonment." The woman beside him touched his arm. "David, maybe we should." "No, it's fine," I said to her. "You should hear this. You should know who you're with when things get difficult." I turned back to David. "I hope you've learned something from what happened between us. I hope you'll be better for the next person. But I don't owe you forgiveness, and I don't owe you a second chance." "Sarah, please." "I survived cancer, David. I survived being abandoned by the person who was supposed to love me most. I rebuilt my entire life from nothing and created something better than what I had before. I'm not going backward." I walked away from him then, toward a group of fellow cancer survivors who were laughing at something Dr. Reeves had said. These people understood resilience, understood the preciousness of life, understood that every day was a gift to be lived fully. As I rejoined my chosen family, I heard David's companion asking him questions in a sharp whisper. I didn't turn around to see his responses. I didn't need to. 6 months later, I heard through mutual friends that David's new relationship had ended. Apparently, she'd decided she couldn't trust someone who had abandoned his wife during cancer treatment. The story had followed him, as I'd known it would, and his reputation in our social circle had never recovered. I felt no satisfaction in this news, only a kind of sad vindication that his choices had consequences beyond our marriage. My own life continued to expand in ways I could never have imagined during those dark months of treatment and abandonment. The Cancer Center offered me a position developing their new patient family support programs, recognizing that medical crises affected entire family systems, not just patients. Dr. Reeves and I had become genuine friends, bonding over our shared commitment to comprehensive cancer care. He was a quiet man, devoted to his research and his patients, and I found his steady presence comforting after years of David's emotional volatility. Our friendship deepened gradually, built on professional respect and personal admiration. When he asked me to dinner one evening, not as colleagues but as something more, I said yes without hesitation. I should tell you, I said over wine at a small Italian restaurant that reminded me of my healing trip to Tuscany, I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I've learned I'm quite good at taking care of myself. James smiled, the kind of smile that had made him a favorite among patients who needed hope alongside medical treatment. Good. I'm not looking for someone to take care of either. I'm looking for someone to share adventures with. Our relationship developed with the patience and intentionality that comes from having both faced loss and understood the value of what remains. James had lost his first wife to cancer 15 years earlier, and while our experiences were different, we shared an understanding of life's fragility and preciousness. We traveled together, back to Italy, where I showed him the church Marco was restoring, then to Japan for a medical conference that became an excuse to explore temples and gardens. We worked together on research projects that improved patient care and family support systems, but most importantly, we built a partnership based on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of deep compatibility that can only exist between people who have both been tested by life and emerged stronger. 2 years after my divorce was finalized, 3 years after my cancer diagnosis, James and I were married in a small ceremony at the Cancer Center's garden, surrounded by the medical team who had saved my life and the family of friends who had supported my recovery. Dr. Reeves, now simply James, had become the love I never knew I was looking for, and I had become the partner he thought he'd never find again. Janet, serving as my matron of honor, wiped tears from her eyes as she watched us exchange vows we'd written ourselves. You know, she said at the reception, when David left you at that treatment center, I thought it was the worst thing that could happen to you. I never imagined it was actually the best thing. The cancer was the worst thing, I corrected, raising my glass to toast the friends and colleagues who had become my chosen family. David leaving was just the thing that taught me I was strong enough to choose something better. As James and I danced to our first song, At Last, by Etta James, which seemed appropriate for two people who had found love after loss, I caught sight of my reflection in the garden's fountain. The woman looking back at me bore little resemblance to the frightened cancer patient who had sat alone in that treatment chair. This woman had silver-streaked hair that caught the light beautifully, laugh lines around her eyes that spoke of joy rediscovered, and the kind of confidence that comes from having survived the worst and chosen to thrive anyway. 5 years after David abandoned me during chemotherapy, I stood in that same treatment center, but this time I was there as the Director of Patient and Family Services, implementing programs that ensured no one would face their medical crisis alone the way I had. The wing had been expanded and renovated, with comfortable family areas, support group meeting rooms, and a resource center filled with information about everything from nutrition during treatment to financial assistance programs. Most importantly, it included the new Family Bridge Initiative, a program that provided counseling and support for families struggling with the stress of medical crises, helping them find ways to support each other instead of falling apart. During the dedication ceremony, I spoke about the importance of comprehensive care that recognized patients as whole people with families, fears, and futures worth fighting for. 5 years ago, I sat in this treatment center as a patient, facing not just cancer but facing it alone. I told the gathered crowd of medical professionals, donors, and families affected by cancer. That experience taught me that healing requires more than medical intervention. It requires community, support, and the knowledge that someone believes in your future. In the audience, I spotted several familiar faces. Maria, the nurse who had first suggested calling my sister. Dr. Kim, whose research had contributed to my recovery. Catherine, my divorce attorney who had become a friend, and James, whose love had taught me that partnership meant choosing each other every day, especially during the difficult ones. After the ceremony, a young woman approached me, thin, wearing a colorful scarf over her bald head, accompanied by a man who looked exhausted and overwhelmed. "Mrs. Reeves?" she said tentatively. "I'm Linda, and this is my husband Mark. We just started treatment here, and we heard about your story. Mark is having a hard time with seeing me like this. We were wondering if you could talk to us." I looked at Mark, who had the same deer-in-headlights expression David had worn during my early treatments. But unlike David, he was here. He was asking for help instead of running away. "Of course," I said, leading them to one of the family consultation rooms we'd designed for exactly these conversations. "The first thing you should know is that being scared doesn't make you a bad husband, Mark. What you do with that fear is what matters." Over the next hour, I shared what I'd learned about partnership during medical crises, about choosing love over fear, about the difference between protecting someone and abandoning them. Mark listened intently, asked thoughtful questions, and held Linda's hand throughout our conversation. When they left, Linda hugged me tightly. "Thank you," she whispered. "I was so afraid he was going to leave like my friend's husband did during her treatment." "He's not going to leave," I said confidently. "He's here asking for help, instead of pretending everything is fine. That's exactly what you want in a partner." As I watched them walk down the hallway together, Mark's arm around Linda's shoulders, I felt the deep satisfaction that came from turning my worst experience into something that could help others avoid the same pain. That evening, James and I sat on our deck overlooking the hills of Marin County, sharing a bottle of wine and discussing the day's events. We'd been married 2 years now, and our partnership had settled into the kind of comfortable rhythm that comes from genuine compatibility and shared purpose. "You know what struck me about that couple today?" James said, reaching for my hand. "How grateful they were for your story. They saw you as someone who had survived not just cancer, but everything that came with it." "I am someone who survived," I said, squeezing his fingers. "All of it. The cancer, the abandonment, the divorce, the fear that I'd never trust anyone again. And now?" I looked at my husband, this kind, brilliant man who had stood by my side through my continued recovery, through the challenges of building a new career, through the everyday joys and difficulties of creating a life together. Now I know that the worst thing that happened to me led to the best thing that happened to me, not because I needed to suffer to find happiness, but because suffering taught me what I really needed in a partner and in a life. James raised his glass to mine. "To survival," he said. "To thriving," I corrected, and we drank to the life we'd built together. A life that honored the past without being limited by it. A life that embraced the future without fear. 10 years after David abandoned me in that treatment center, I received an unexpected letter. It arrived at my office at the cancer center, forwarded from my old address with David's familiar handwriting on the envelope. Inside was a brief note and a newspaper clipping. The clipping was my photo from a recent article about innovative cancer support programs. In it, I was smiling broadly, surrounded by patients and their families at a support group graduation ceremony. The note was simple. "Sarah, I saw this article and wanted you to know how proud I am of what you've built. I know I have no right to say that, but it's true. I've spent the last 10 years thinking about the choices I made during your illness, and I understand now what I couldn't understand then. I was weak when you needed me to be strong, and selfish when you needed me to be generous. I'm glad you found someone who deserves you. I hope you can forgive me someday, not for my sake, but for yours. David." I read the letter twice, then shared it with James over dinner that night. "Neeker, how do you feel about it?" he asked. I considered the question carefully. 10 years ago, 5 years ago, even 2 years ago, a letter from David would have stirred up anger, hurt, or at minimum, a complex mix of emotions about our shared past. Now I felt something simpler, a kind of peaceful closure. "I feel sorry for him," I said finally. "He lost something precious because he was too afraid to appreciate it while he had it. And I feel grateful." Grateful? His abandonment forced me to discover who I was when I could only rely on myself. If he had stayed and been minimally supportive, I might never have learned how strong I actually was. I might never have rebuilt my life so completely. James nodded thoughtfully. "So in a way, his worst choice led to your best life." Exactly. And that's not something I need to forgive him for, that's something I need to thank him for. I never wrote back to David, but I kept his letter as a reminder of how far I'd traveled from the frightened woman who had sat alone in that treatment chair, abandoned by the person who was supposed to love her most. 15 years after my diagnosis, 20 years after meeting James, I stood once again in the oncology treatment center, but this time as a patient advocate accompanying a young mother through her first chemotherapy session. Maria, now head nurse, had called me because the patient, Rosa, was facing treatment alone. Her husband had left when she was diagnosed, taking their 2 young children to live with his family in another state while she got better. "I don't understand," Rosa said as we sat together, the familiar IV drip slowly delivering medicine into her arm. "We promised each other for better or worse, in sickness and in health. How could he just leave?" I held her hand and thought about the 20-year journey that had brought me to this moment, qualified not just by my professional training, but by the lived experience of surviving both cancer and abandonment. "Some people aren't capable of keeping those promises when they're tested," I said gently. "But that says something about them, not about you. You're not less worthy of love because someone else couldn't rise to the occasion." "But I'm scared," Rosa whispered. "What if I can't do this alone?" I smiled, remembering my own terror at facing an uncertain future without the partner I'd counted on. "Rosa, look at me," I said. "I sat in this exact chair 20 years ago, abandoned by my husband, terrified and alone. Today, I'm married to a wonderful man who would never dream of leaving me during a crisis. I run the patient support programs for this entire hospital system. I've helped thousands of people navigate exactly what you're going through. My life is fuller and richer and more meaningful than it ever was before I got sick." Her eyes widened. "Really? Really? You're going to discover reserves of strength you never knew you had. You're going to build a support system of people who choose to stand by you. And someday, you're going to help someone else who's sitting where you are right now, feeling exactly what you're feeling." As I sat with Rosa through her treatment, I reflected on the extraordinary path that had led me from victim to survivor, to advocate to partner to mentor. Each role had built on the last, creating a life richer and more purposeful than anything I could have imagined during those dark early days. The woman I'd become was someone David could never have imagined, someone his abandonment had made possible. In trying to escape the challenge of loving someone through crisis, he'd freed me to discover what I was truly capable of becoming. When Rosa's treatment ended, she hugged me tightly. "Will you be here for my next session?" "Absolutely," I promised. "And by the time your treatment is over, you're going to be strong enough to be here for someone else." As I walked through the halls of the cancer center that had been the site of both my greatest despair and my most profound transformation, I passed the plaque that marked the dedication of the Family Bridge Initiative Wing. In honor of all the patients and families who have discovered that healing requires not just medical intervention, but community, courage, and the unwavering belief that everyone deserves to be supported through their darkest moments. Below it, in smaller text, was a quote I'd suggested. "Sometimes the people who abandon us teach us something more valuable than those who stay, that we are strong enough to survive without them." I paused in front of that plaque, as I often did, and thought about the 20-year journey from abandonment to advocacy, from victim to victor, from broken to beautifully rebuilt. David's face when my medical team had arrived to tell me I was going to live would forever be seared in my memory, not as a painful reminder of betrayal, but as the moment I began to understand that survival wasn't just about beating cancer. It was about discovering that the only person who could never abandon me was myself. And that person, it turned out, was more than strong enough to build an extraordinary life. 25 years after my diagnosis, I received a call that would change everything again, though this time in the most wonderful way possible. "Mrs. Reeves, this is Dr. Amanda Foster from the National Cancer Institute. We'd like to discuss an opportunity with you." I was in my office at the Cancer Center, reviewing applications for our new Patient Navigator Fellowship program, when the call came through. The NCI was something of a holy grail in cancer advocacy, the federal agency that coordinated cancer research and policy across the entire country. We've been following your work with family support systems and patient advocacy for several years, Dr. Foster continued. We're launching a national initiative to standardize comprehensive cancer care that includes psychological and social support alongside medical treatment. We'd like you to lead the development of these standards. I set down my pen and looked out the window at the garden where James and I had been married, where hundreds of patients and families had found peace during their own difficult journeys. You want me to create a national program? More than that. We want you to transform how cancer care is delivered across the United States. Your model here has become the gold standard. We want to scale it to every cancer center in the country. The opportunity was staggering. For 25 years, I'd been working to ensure that no one would face cancer alone the way I had. Now I was being offered the chance to make that vision a reality on a national scale. But it would mean leaving the cancer center that had been my professional home, the place where my transformation had begun. It would mean relocating to Washington, D.C. and taking on challenges I'd never imagined. That evening, I shared the news with James over dinner at our favorite restaurant, the same Italian place where he'd first asked me out as more than a colleague. It's an incredible opportunity, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand, but it's also a huge disruption to everything we've built here. I know. I keep thinking about Rosa and all the other patients who count on our programs. How can I leave them? James smiled with the patience and wisdom that had made him such an extraordinary partner. Sarah, you're not leaving them. You're expanding what you can do for them. Think about it. Instead of helping hundreds of patients here, you could be helping hundreds of thousands of patients everywhere. And you? Your research is based here. Your patients are here. My research on immunotherapy is at a point where it can be conducted anywhere with proper facilities. And as for patients... He paused, his eyes twinkling with an expression I'd learned to recognize as his, I have something to tell you. Look, the NCI has been courting me too. They want to establish a new national research center for precision immunotherapy. They asked if I'd be interested in directing it. I stared at him. You've known about this? Dr. Foster called me last week to ask if I thought you'd be interested in their offer, and whether I'd be supportive of the move. I told her that where you go, I go. Then she mentioned they'd been planning to approach me anyway. The synchronicity felt like the universe conspiring to move us toward our next chapter. Just as my cancer diagnosis had ultimately led to the best parts of my life, this opportunity felt like another door opening at exactly the right moment. 3 months later, James and I were living in a townhouse in Georgetown, and I was walking into the Eisenhower Executive Office building for my first day as director of the National Comprehensive Cancer Care Initiative. The scope of the work was breathtaking. My team included oncologists, psychologists, social workers, policy experts, and patient advocates from across the country. Our mandate was to develop standards that would transform cancer care from a purely medical intervention to a holistic support system that addressed every aspect of a patient's journey. But the real validation came 6 months into the job, when I received a letter that made everything worth it. Dear Mrs. Reeves, my name is Jennifer Martinez, and I'm writing to thank you for saving my marriage. Last year, my husband Roberto was diagnosed with stage 3 colon cancer. When we went to our local cancer center for treatment, they enrolled us in something called the Family Bridge program that you developed. The counselor there told us about your story, how your husband left you during treatment, and how you used that experience to create programs that keep families together during medical crises. Roberto was terrified, not just of the cancer, but of becoming a burden on me and our children. I was terrified too, but I was more afraid of losing him than of facing the challenge together. The Family Bridge program gave us tools to talk about our fears, strategies for supporting each other, and most importantly, hope that we could come through this stronger. Roberto finished treatment 3 months ago and is in complete remission. But more than that, our marriage is stronger than it's ever been. We learned to face fear together, instead of letting it drive us apart. I know you'll probably never see this letter, but I wanted you to know that the worst thing that happened to you became the best thing that happened to my family. We're together, and we're grateful, and it's because of what you built from your pain. I read that letter 3 times before sharing it with my team during our weekly meeting. These letters arrived regularly now, from patients and families across the country, whose lives had been touched by programs that grew out of my experience with abandonment and recovery. "You know what I find remarkable about your story?" said Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychiatrist on my team who specialized in medical trauma. "Most people who experience profound betrayal during a health crisis become bitter or withdrawn. You became generative. You turned your wound into a source of healing for others." "I had good models," I said, thinking of Dr. Reeves and Maria and all the medical professionals who had shown me what true care looked like. And I had the motivation of never wanting anyone else to feel as alone as I felt. The national program launched 2 years later with a ceremony at the Kennedy Center, attended by cancer survivors, medical professionals, and policymakers from across the country. The patient and family first standards were being implemented in over 800 cancer centers, fundamentally changing how the disease was treated in America. During my keynote speech that evening, I spoke about the journey from abandonment to advocacy that had brought us to this moment. 27 years ago, I sat alone in a cancer treatment center, abandoned by the person who had promised to love me in sickness and in health. I told the audience of 1,500 people. That abandonment was devastating, but it was also educational. It taught me exactly what patients and families need during medical crises, because it showed me everything they shouldn't have to face alone. In the audience, I spotted faces that represented every stage of my journey. Janet, who had driven across the country to be there. Catherine Walsh, my divorce attorney who had become a lifelong friend. Dr. Reeves and Maria from my original medical team. Rosa, the young mother I'd mentored who was now cancer-free and working as a patient advocate herself. And dozens of other survivors whose lives had intersected with mine over the years. But the most meaningful presence was James, sitting in the front row with the kind of pride and love that had sustained me through every challenge since we'd found each other. After the ceremony, at the reception overlooking the Potomac River, I was approached by a familiar figure I almost didn't recognize. "Sarah?" I turned to find David, now in his early 60s, looking uncertain and somewhat frail. He was thinner than I remembered, with gray hair and deep lines around his eyes that spoke of years I knew nothing about. David. I was surprised to find that seeing him after all these years didn't trigger anger or hurt, just a kind of mild curiosity. "I didn't expect to see you here. I saw the coverage of your speech on the news. I've been following your work for years, actually. When I heard you were being honored tonight," he paused, looking around at the celebration, "I wanted to congratulate you, and to apologize, again, more properly this time." James appeared at my side, not possessively but supportively, ready to intervene if needed, but trusting my ability to handle the situation. "David, this is my husband, Dr. James Reeves. James, this is David Patterson." The two men shook hands with the careful politeness of people who understood exactly who they were to each other. "Dr. Reeves, I've read about your research," David said. "Your work on immunotherapy has helped a lot of people." "Thank you," James replied simply. I studied David, trying to understand what had brought him here after nearly 3 decades. He looked tired in a way that went beyond age, carrying himself like someone who had learned difficult lessons too late to change their consequences. "Sarah," David said, "I know I have no right to ask this, but I was wondering if we could talk privately for a few minutes. There are things I need to say that I should have said years ago." I looked at James, who nodded encouragingly. "I'll be right over there," he said, squeezing my hand before walking toward a group of colleagues. David and I found a quiet corner of the reception hall, away from the celebration but still within view of the crowd that represented my chosen family and professional community. "I want to tell you something I've never told anyone," David began. "After our divorce, I spent years telling people that you had changed during your illness, that the cancer had made you bitter and unreasonable, that you had pushed me away." I waited, unsurprised by this revelation but curious about where it was leading. 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with diabetes. Not life-threatening like your cancer, but requiring significant lifestyle changes and regular medical care. My second wife, you remember, the woman I was with at that charity gala, she left me within 6 months of the diagnosis. The irony was not lost on either of us. She said she hadn't signed up to be a caregiver, David continued. That she was too young to deal with someone else's health problems. Sound familiar? "I'm sorry that happened to you," I said, and meant it. "The thing is, when she left, I finally understood what I had done to you. I understood the fear you must have felt, the the isolation, the betrayal. And I realized that all those years I'd been telling myself and others that you were the problem, I was lying. He looked out at the reception, where hundreds of people were celebrating advances in cancer care that had grown directly from my experience of his abandonment. You were facing death, and I made it about my discomfort. You needed support, and I needed to preserve my image of myself as a good person. So I left, and I spent the next 25 years convincing myself that leaving was justified. What changed? I asked. Sitting alone in a hospital room while she packed her things at home, I finally admitted the truth. I was a coward. I abandoned the person I was supposed to love most when she needed me most. And you, look what you built from that abandonment. He gestured toward the celebration, toward the recognition, toward the visible evidence of a life lived in service to others. I spent 25 years running from the guilt of what I did to you. You spent 25 years transforming that experience into something that helps thousands of other people. That's the difference between us. I considered his words carefully. This was the apology I'd never received, the acknowledgement of harm I'd never expected to hear. But I found that I didn't need it anymore. David, I appreciate you telling me this. I think it was probably important for you to say it. But I want you to know that I forgave you years ago, not for your sake, but for mine. Carrying anger about what you did would have poisoned everything good that came after. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about what people deserve. It's about what gives you peace. And I've had peace for a long time now. We stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, two people whose lives had diverged dramatically from a single point of crisis, now meeting again as completely different versions of themselves. Can I ask you something? David said finally. Of course. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I had stayed? If I had been the husband you needed during your illness? I looked across the room at James, who was deep in conversation with Dr. Williams about some aspect of their research collaboration. I thought about the life we'd built together, the work we'd accomplished, the thousands of patients and families who had been helped by programs born from my experience of abandonment. Honestly, I think we would have gotten through the cancer, probably stayed married, and lived a perfectly fine life. But I never would have become this person. I never would have discovered what I was capable of building. Your abandonment forced me to find strength I didn't know I had and purpose I never would have discovered otherwise. David absorbed this, understanding perhaps for the first time that his worst choice had inadvertently led to my best life. So in a way, I continued, you gave me the greatest gift you could have given me. You set me free to become who I was meant to be. As David walked away that evening, disappearing back into whatever life he'd built from the ruins of his choices, I felt a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun 27 years ago in a cancer treatment center had finally closed. The following morning, James and I flew back to San Francisco for a brief visit to the cancer center before returning to Washington. I wanted to see the latest expansion of the patient support programs and check in with the current team. Walking through the halls where my transformation had begun, I marveled at how much had changed. The treatment areas were larger and more comfortable, filled with natural light and designed to feel more like healing spaces than clinical environments. The family support areas bustled with activity, support groups, educational sessions, children's programs for young patients and siblings of patients. But the most meaningful change was in the treatment rooms themselves. No longer did patients sit alone with their IV drips. Every chair was accompanied by a comfortable seat for a support person, and the walls were covered with photos and stories from patients who had successfully completed treatment. Maria, now in her 70s but still working as head of patient services, gave us a tour of the latest additions. You know what I'm proudest of? She said as we stood in the main treatment area. We haven't had a single patient go through treatment alone in over 5 years. Not one. Between family support programs, volunteer companions, and peer mentors, everyone has someone with them. I thought about my younger self, sitting in this space alone and afraid, and felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that no one else would have to experience that particular form of abandonment. Our final stop was the Memorial Garden. where plaques honored patients who had lost their battles with cancer. I was surprised to find a new addition: a bench dedicated to patients who had been abandoned during treatment, with an inscription that read, "For those who faced their darkest hours alone and discovered they were stronger than they knew, your courage lights the way for others." Beneath it, in smaller text, inspired by Sarah Chen Patterson Reeves, who transformed abandonment into advocacy and showed us all that our worst experiences can become our greatest gifts to others. I sat on that bench with James beside me, looking out at the garden where cancer patients and their families found moments of peace during their difficult journeys. The late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, and I could hear laughter from the children's area where siblings of young patients were playing. "Any regrets?" James asked, taking my hand in his. I considered the question seriously. Did I regret the cancer that had nearly killed me? The abandonment that had shattered my first marriage? The years of struggle and uncertainty that had followed? None, I said finally. Every painful thing that happened led to something beautiful. The cancer led to my recovery and my purpose. David leaving led to my independence and eventually to you. The fear and isolation led to programs that have helped thousands of families stay together during medical crises. And now, I looked at my husband, this brilliant, compassionate man who had chosen to love me not despite my scars but because of how beautifully I'd healed. I thought about our work together, the research that was saving lives, and the policies that were transforming how medical crises were handled across the country. Now I get to spend the rest of my life helping other people discover what they're capable of surviving and thriving through. I can't imagine anything more meaningful than that. As we sat in that garden, surrounded by the evidence of lives touched and transformed by comprehensive cancer care, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought me from victim to survivor to advocate to national leader. The woman who had been abandoned during chemotherapy 27 years ago had become someone who ensured that abandonment was no longer possible in modern cancer care. The scared, isolated patient had become a force for healing that extended far beyond her own experience. That evening, as James and I prepared to return to Washington and our continued work transforming cancer care across America, I received one final gift from the day. Rosa, the young mother I'd mentored years earlier, stopped by our hotel with her 2 children, the same children her husband had taken when she was diagnosed. "Sarah, I wanted you to meet my kids," she said, beaming with pride and health. "Miguel and Sophia, this is the lady I told you about, the one who helped Mama when she was sick." The children, now teenagers, shook my hand politely, but Sophia, the younger one, looked at me with the kind of directness that only teenagers possess. "Mama says you were really sick once, and your husband left you, but you made it so that other people's families wouldn't fall apart like yours did." "That's right," I said. "That's pretty cool," Sophia said. "You turned something bad into something good for everybody." Out of the mouths of babes, I thought. "I had help," I said. "A lot of good people showed me how to do it." As Rosa and her children walked away, I realized that this was how legacies were really built. Not through grand gestures or public recognition, but through individual lives touched and transformed, creating ripple effects that extended far beyond what any one person could see or measure. 30 years after David abandoned me during cancer treatment, 45 years after my father first brought our family to America seeking a better life, I stood once again in front of a room full of oncology professionals, this time at the International Cancer Care Conference in Geneva. I was 64 years old, with silver hair that I wore proudly and laugh lines that spoke of a life well lived. James sat in the front row, now my partner in every sense for over 2 decades, his own hair white but his eyes still bright with the passion for healing that had first drawn me to him. When I was first diagnosed with cancer 30 years ago, I began my keynote address to the global audience. I thought the disease was the worst thing that could happen to me. I was wrong. The worst thing was being abandoned by the person who had promised to love me through exactly such crises. The audience of 2,000 cancer care professionals from 60 countries listened intently as I shared the story that had become a touchstone for comprehensive cancer care worldwide. But here's what I've learned in the 3 decades since. Sometimes our greatest wounds become our most powerful gifts. The abandonment that nearly destroyed me became the foundation for programs that have supported hundreds of thousands of patients and families worldwide. The statistics were staggering, even to me. The patient and family first standards I'd developed were now implemented in over 3,000 cancer centers across 47 countries. An estimated 2 million patients had received comprehensive support services based on models that grew from my experience of being alone during treatment. The goal was never to prevent all suffering, I continued. The goal was to ensure that no one suffers alone, and that every person facing medical crisis has access to the support systems that can transform survival into thriving. After my speech, during the reception, I was approached by a young oncologist from Kenya whose cancer center had just implemented our family support protocols. "Dr. Reeves," she said, "I wanted to thank you for your work. We've seen a dramatic improvement in patient outcomes since we started addressing family dynamics alongside medical treatment. But I have to ask, do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if your husband hadn't left you?" It was a question I'd been asked countless times over the years, and my answer had evolved as I'd gained perspective on my journey. "I spent many years angry about what he took from me," I said, "but eventually I realized he didn't take anything from me. He revealed what was already there. The strength, the resilience, the capacity for building something meaningful from pain. Those qualities were mine all along. His abandonment just forced me to discover them." The young doctor nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying that crisis reveals character rather than creating it?" "Exactly. And sometimes what it reveals is that we're capable of far more than we ever imagined." That night, in our hotel room overlooking Lake Geneva, James and I reflected on how far we'd traveled from those early days, when I was rebuilding my life after divorce, and he was a widowed researcher focused entirely on his work. "Do you know what I'm most grateful for?" James said as we watched the lights reflect on the water. "Tell me that David was exactly who he was when you needed him most. If he had been a better man, you might never have become the extraordinary woman you are. And I might never have had the privilege of being your partner in this work." I leaned against my husband's shoulder, thinking about the millions of small choices and circumstances that had led us to this moment. A different husband might have supported me through cancer in a way that kept our marriage intact, but never pushed me to discover my own strength. A different diagnosis might have been less serious, requiring less transformation. A different set of medical professionals might not have shown me what true care looked like. "It's strange to be grateful for the worst thing that ever happened to you," I said. "Maybe that's the definition of wisdom, recognizing that our worst experiences often carry our greatest gifts, even when we can't see them at the time." 5 years later, on the 40th anniversary of my cancer diagnosis, I made a decision that surprised everyone, including myself. I retired from active leadership of the National Comprehensive Cancer Care Initiative to write a book. The decision came after receiving a letter from a teenage girl whose mother was undergoing treatment for breast cancer. The girl, Emma, had written to tell me that her father was struggling with her mother's illness but was getting help through one of our family support programs. "Dear Dr. Reeves," the letter read, "I wanted to thank you for creating programs that keep families together during cancer. My dad was really scared when Mom got sick, and I think he might have left if he hadn't learned about how to handle his feelings and support her properly. But now he's her biggest advocate, and our family is stronger than ever. My mom says you understand about this stuff because you went through it yourself. I'm writing a school report about people who turn their problems into solutions for other people, and I'd like to write about you. Could you tell me your story?" Emma's request made me realize that while the programs and policies we'd created would continue helping people long after I was gone, the story behind them, the human journey from abandonment to advocacy, needed to be preserved for future generations who might face similar challenges. The Strength to Stand Alone: How Abandonment Taught Me to Build Community was published 2 years later and became an unexpected bestseller. But more than its commercial success, the book served as a bridge between my personal story and the broader lessons about resilience, healing, and transformation that could help anyone facing crisis. The book tour took James and me to cities across the country and around the world, speaking to audiences that ranged from medical professionals to cancer support groups to business leaders interested in crisis management. Each event reinforced the universality of the themes we were discussing. Everyone, at some point, faced abandonment, betrayal, or crisis that forced them to discover who they really were. But the most meaningful events were the small support group meetings in cancer centers, where I sat in circles with patients and families who were living through experiences similar to what I'd faced decades earlier. "The hardest part isn't the cancer," one woman told me during a session in Phoenix. "It's feeling like my husband sees me as already dead. He's grieving someone who's still sitting right here, fighting to live." I recognized that expression, that particular pain, of being mourned prematurely by someone who was supposed to be supporting your fight for survival. "What I learned," I told her, "is that some people are capable of loving you through crisis, and some people aren't. The ones who aren't capable usually reveal themselves quickly. And while that's devastating, it's also information you can use to build the support system you actually need." "But how do you stop loving someone just because they can't handle your illness?" "You don't stop loving them," I said, "but you start loving yourself enough to insist on support that actually supports you. Sometimes that means setting boundaries with people who aren't capable of rising to the occasion, and sometimes it means ending relationships that have become harmful to your healing." These conversations reminded me why I'd been drawn to advocacy work in the first place. Behind every policy and program were real people facing real struggles, and the most important thing I could offer them wasn't just systematic support, but the living example that survival and thriving were possible. On my 70th birthday, James organized a surprise celebration that brought together people from every stage of my journey. The party was held at the cancer center where my transformation had begun, in the garden where we'd been married over 20 years earlier. Janet, now in her 80s but still sharp and spirited, served as the unofficial host. She'd become something of a legend in her own right as the sister who had supported me through my darkest days and celebrated every victory since. "You know," Janet said during her toast, "when Sarah called me from that hospital 40 years ago to say that David had abandoned her during chemotherapy, I was ready to drive to his office and tell him exactly what I thought of him." Sarah stopped me. She said she needed to use her energy for healing, not for revenge. I think that decision, to focus on moving forward rather than looking backward, is what made everything else possible. The celebration included video messages from patients and families around the world whose lives had been touched by programs I'd developed, researchers whose work had been funded through initiatives I'd championed, and policymakers who had implemented comprehensive cancer care standards based on our model. But the most moving tribute came from Rosa, now in her 50s and running patient advocacy programs in 3 states. She'd brought her children, now adults with children of their own, to meet the woman who had helped their mother navigate cancer treatment and family crisis. "Sarah didn't just help me survive cancer," Rosa told the gathering. "She taught me that my experience of suffering could become a source of strength for other people. That the worst thing that happened to me could become the foundation for the best work I could do in the world." As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, I found myself standing in the same spot where I'd first met Dr. Reeves, now James, all those years ago. The cancer center had grown exponentially, but this garden remained largely unchanged, still offering peace and beauty to people facing the uncertainty of medical treatment. "Any wisdom for the next 40 years?" James asked, joining me beside the fountain where we'd often sat during our courtship and early marriage. I considered the question. At 70, I felt more energetic and purposeful than I had at 34, when cancer had first forced me to confront my own mortality. The intervening decades had taught me that aging could be a process of expansion rather than diminishment, if you chose to keep growing and contributing. "I think the wisdom is that there are no final chapters," I said. "Every ending becomes a new beginning if you're open to possibility. Every crisis carries the seeds of transformation. Every loss creates space for something unexpected and often wonderful." "Speaking of new beginnings," James said with the smile I'd learned meant he had news to share, "I got a call this week from the director of the new Global Health Innovation Center at Stanford. They're looking for someone to establish a department of patient-centered care research. Someone with experience bridging the gap between medical research and human support systems." I stared at him. "They offered you a position?" "They offered us positions. Both of us. You as director of the new department, me as head of precision medicine research. They want us to create a model for how medical research and patient advocacy can work together to transform healthcare." The opportunity was breathtaking in its scope and possibility. After decades of working within existing systems to create change, we were being offered the chance to build something entirely new from the ground up. It would mean leaving Washington, I said. It would mean going home, James corrected. Back to where this all started, but bringing everything we've learned in the years since. That night, as we lay in bed in our hotel room near the cancer center, I thought about the extraordinary circular nature of life's journey. 40 years after being abandoned during treatment, 35 years after my divorce, 25 years after marrying James, we were being invited to return to the region where my transformation had begun, but now as established leaders in the field we'd helped create. The girl who had been told she'd never make it by her father's predictions about immigrants in America, the woman who had been abandoned by her husband during the fight of her life, had not only made it, but had created new definitions of what making it could mean. 6 months later, James and I moved into a house in Palo Alto, just 20 minutes from Stanford University, and an hour from the Golden Dragon restaurant, where my father still held court at age 95, regaling customers with stories about his daughter, who had, quote, shown the world what persistence and good values could accomplish. Our new home had a garden where I could write and think, space for the grandchildren we hoped to have someday, and enough room to host the dinners and gatherings that would become central to building our new department at Stanford. But before we began our new work, I had one final piece of business to handle. I drove to the address I'd kept in my files for 30 years, David's last known residence. According to the private investigator, I'd hired more out of curiosity than any need for closure. I wasn't sure what I wanted to say to him, or even if I wanted to say anything at all. I just knew that before starting this new chapter, I needed to face the person whose abandonment had made everything else possible. David's house was modest, in a suburban neighborhood that spoke of a life that had settled into comfortable routine rather than ambitious achievement. When he opened the door, I was struck by how much he'd aged. Not just the gray hair and lines that time brings to everyone, but a quality of resignation that suggested dreams deferred or abandoned. Sarah, he seemed more surprised than shocked to see me. I saw the news about your new position at Stanford. Congratulations. Thank you. I was in the area and thought, well, I'm not sure what I thought, but I wanted to see you. He invited me in for coffee, and we sat in his small kitchen, making the awkward small talk of people whose lives had diverged completely, but who shared a history too significant to ignore. I followed your career over the years, David said finally. The work you've done, the people you've helped. I'm proud of you. I know I don't have the right to say that, but it's true. You can be proud, I said. In a way, you contributed to it all. He looked puzzled, so I explained what I'd come to understand over the decades since our divorce. David, your abandonment was the catalyst for everything good that came after. If you had been the husband I needed during my illness, I probably would have recovered, we would have stayed married, and I would have gone back to my marketing job and lived a perfectly fine life. But I never would have discovered what I was really capable of creating. He absorbed this, perhaps understanding for the first time that his failure had inadvertently been the foundation for my success. So what you're saying is that the worst thing I ever did became the best thing that ever happened to you? In a way, yes. But more than that. It became the best thing that happened to hundreds of thousands of other people who benefited from programs I built based on that experience. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two people who had once promised to love each other forever, now strangers connected only by the ways their past choices had shaped their present lives. I want you to know, David said finally, that not a day goes by that I don't regret how I handled your illness. Not because of what it cost me, but because of what it cost you at the time. You were facing death, and I made it about my own discomfort. That was unforgivable. It was human, I corrected gently. People make choices based on fear and weakness all the time. The difference is what they do with the consequences of those choices. You've spent 30 years regretting yours. I spent 30 years transforming mine into something useful. As I prepared to leave, David walked me to my car. Sarah, can I ask you something? Of course. Are you happy? I mean really happy, not just professionally successful. I thought about James. waiting for me at home with dinner plans and research ideas he wanted to discuss. I thought about the new department we were building, the students we would mentor, the research that would improve countless lives. I thought about the book I was writing about turning crisis into opportunity, the grandchildren we hoped to have, the decades of meaningful work that still lay ahead. I'm happier than I ever imagined possible, I said truthfully. The life I built after our marriage ended is richer and more fulfilling than anything I could have conceived when we were together. I'm glad, David said, and I believed he meant it. You deserve happiness. As I drove away from David's house and toward my future, I reflected on how completely the narrative of my life had transformed. The woman who had once defined herself by her marriage and her husband's approval had become someone whose identity was rooted in her own values, achievements, and contributions to the world. The victim had become a victor, not by conquering anyone else, but by conquering the limitations that others had tried to impose on her possibilities. 3 months later, I stood in front of my first class at Stanford. 30 graduate students from medicine, psychology, social work, and public policy who had come together to study patient-centered care innovation. The classroom overlooked the same hills I'd admired as an undergraduate 45 years earlier, when I'd been a young woman uncertain about her future and unaware of the challenges and triumphs that awaited her. Welcome to Introduction to Comprehensive Healthcare Systems, I said to the eager faces looking back at me. This course is based on a simple premise: that healing involves more than medical intervention. It requires addressing the emotional, social, and psychological needs of patients and their families. I gestured to a photo on the wall, a picture of the original cancer center garden where my journey had begun. Everything we'll learn in this class grew from a real-world crisis. It started with a woman who was abandoned during cancer treatment and decided to use that experience to ensure that other people would never face medical crises alone. A student raised her hand. Was that woman you, Professor Reeves? I smiled, thinking about how different my life had become from anything I could have imagined when I was their age, when I was newly diagnosed with cancer, when I was sitting alone in that treatment chair. Yes, I said, that woman was me. And over the next semester, you're going to learn how the worst thing that ever happened to someone can become the foundation for the most important work they ever do in the world. As the semester unfolded, I watched these brilliant young minds grapple with the concepts we were exploring: how trauma could become a source of wisdom, how personal experience could inform systematic change, how individual healing could contribute to collective transformation. Their questions and insights reminded me why I'd been drawn to teaching. Each student brought their own experiences of crisis and recovery, their own ideas about how healthcare could be more humane and effective. One student, Maria Santos, the daughter of an immigrant family, like I had been decades earlier, approached me after class one day with a question that took me back to my own early struggles with belonging and achievement. Professor Reeves, my family doesn't understand why I want to work in healthcare advocacy instead of becoming a traditional doctor. They think I'm wasting my education on something that won't make money or bring prestige. How do you handle family opposition to your calling? I looked at this bright young woman and saw myself at her age, torn between family expectations and personal vision, uncertain about whether following her own path would lead to success or disappointment. Maria, I said, the people who love us often have very narrow definitions of success, usually based on their own experiences and fears. But sometimes we have to be willing to disappoint them in the short term to become the person we're meant to be in the long term. What if they're right? What if I'm making a mistake? Then you'll learn from the mistake and adjust course. But the biggest mistake you can make is living someone else's definition of success instead of discovering your own. 6 months later, Maria presented her master's thesis research on culturally responsive patient advocacy programs for Spanish-speaking families. Her work was so innovative that it was immediately implemented in 3 major California hospital systems and earned her a full fellowship for doctoral studies. Watching Maria's transformation from uncertain graduate student to confident researcher reminded me of the ripple effects that occurred when people were encouraged to pursue their authentic calling despite external pressures. On the 5-year anniversary of our Stanford program, James and I hosted a reception for alumni, current students, and collaborators from around the world. The Department of Patient-Centered Care Research had grown into one of the university's most prestigious programs, attracting students and faculty from dozens of countries. But the real measure of our success was in the work our graduates were doing, implementing comprehensive cancer care in rural hospitals, developing family support programs for pediatric patients, creating policy frameworks that addressed healthcare disparities, conducting research that bridged the gap between medical intervention and human healing. You know what I'm proudest of? I told the assembled group during my remarks that evening. Not that we've created a successful academic program, but that we've trained a generation of healthcare professionals who understand that their job isn't just to treat disease, but to heal people and support families through some of the most difficult experiences of their lives. In the audience, I spotted faces that represented the full scope of our impact. Former students who were now leading comprehensive care programs in hospitals around the world, research collaborators whose work had transformed standards of practice, and patients and families whose lives had been touched by graduates of our program. But the most meaningful presence was David Jr., the son James and I had adopted 5 years earlier when his teenage mother, one of our former students, had died in a car accident. David was now 8 years old, bright and curious and completely unaware that his unconventional family structure made us anything other than completely normal. Watching David Jr. play with the children of our colleagues, I marveled at how family could be created through choice and commitment, rather than just biology. James and I had found each other in middle age, built a partnership based on shared values and complementary strengths, and now we're raising a child who would grow up understanding that love came in many forms, and that the most important relationships were often the ones you chose rather than the ones you were born into. That night, as James and I tucked David Jr. into bed in our Palo Alto home, our son asked the kind of question that reminded us why children were such extraordinary teachers. "Mom, Dad told me that you got really sick once, and that's how you learned to help other people who get sick. Is that true?" I sat on the edge of his bed, thinking about how to explain the complexity of transformation and resilience to an 8-year-old mind. Yes, that's true. Sometimes hard things happen to us, and we can choose to let those hard things make us bitter and angry, or we can choose to let them teach us how to help other people who are going through similar hard things. Which one did you choose? I chose to let the hard thing teach me. And that's how I met your dad. And that's how we learned to do the work we do together. And that's how we ended up here with you. David Jr. considered this seriously. So if the hard thing hadn't happened, you and Dad might never have met? That's right. And I might not have you and Dad as my parents? Probably not. He nodded with the acceptance that children bring to life's mysteries. Then I'm glad the hard thing happened. Because I like our family the way it is. Out of the mouths of babes, I thought as I kissed him goodnight. Our 8-year-old son had articulated something that had taken me decades to fully understand. That the worst experiences of our lives often set in motion the chain of events that leads to our greatest joys. 45 years after my cancer diagnosis, 50 years after my father's dire predictions about my ability to succeed in America, I found myself exactly where I belonged, surrounded by family I'd chosen and created, engaged in work that honored both my personal experience and my professional calling, and looking forward to a future that would undoubtedly bring new challenges and opportunities for growth. The girl who was told she'd never make it had not only made it, she'd redefined what making it could mean. And in the process, she'd helped thousands of others discover their own definitions of success, resilience, and the courage to transform their worst experiences into their greatest gifts to the world. Standing in my garden on a clear California evening, watching James help David Jr. with a science project while dinner simmered on the stove, I felt the deep contentment that comes from a life lived authentically and in service to something larger than oneself. The journey from abandonment to advocacy, from victim to victor, from isolation to community, had taken 5 decades to complete. But every step of that journey, including the most painful ones, had been necessary to bring me to this moment of perfect, imperfect happiness. And I knew that the story was far from over. There were still students to teach, research to conduct, families to support, and new ways to transform personal experience into collective healing. The woman who had once sat alone in a cancer treatment center, abandoned and afraid, had become exactly who she was meant to be. And that person was just getting started. As I put David Jr. to bed that night and watched him drift off to sleep, I realized that this moment, this ordinary Tuesday evening in our warm, happy home, represented the ultimate victory over everything that had once tried to defeat me. But before heading downstairs to James, I found myself drawn to my study, where I kept a special box of letters and mementos from the journey that had brought me here. Inside were treasures that told the story of transformation, the original discharge papers from my cancer treatment, the divorce decree that had freed me from a loveless marriage, the first letter from a patient whose family had been helped by our programs, photos from my wedding to James in the cancer center garden. At the bottom of the box was something I rarely looked at anymore, a journal entry from 45 years ago, written in my shaky handwriting just days after my diagnosis. I'm so scared, not just of dying but of facing this alone. David seems like a stranger already, and I haven't even started treatment yet. I don't know who I am if I'm not his wife, if I'm not healthy, if I'm not the person everyone expects me to be. What if I'm not strong enough for this? I'm so happy enough alone. Reading those words now, I marveled at how that terrified young woman could never have imagined the life that lay ahead of her. She couldn't have conceived that her husband's abandonment would lead to discovering strength she never knew she possessed. She couldn't have imagined that the medical crisis would become the foundation for a career helping others navigate their own darkest hours. Most of all, she couldn't have imagined that the worst day of her life would eventually become the day she was most grateful for. I reached for a pen and wrote a new entry, dated today. To the woman I used to be. You were strong enough. You were always strong enough. Every tear you cried, every moment of terror you endured, every time you chose to keep fighting when everything seemed hopeless, all of it was preparing you for a life more beautiful than you could have dreamed. The cancer didn't defeat you. The abandonment didn't destroy you, they revealed you. And the person they revealed was magnificent. Fai qua mythai. I closed the journal and returned it to the box, then made my way downstairs to where James was waiting, with his research papers spread across our kitchen table, reading glasses perched on his nose, completely absorbed in data about the latest immunotherapy trials. Any breakthroughs tonight? I asked, settling into the chair beside him. He looked up with the smile that still made my heart skip after all these years. Actually, yes. The new combination therapy we've been testing is showing remarkable results. Survival rates are exceeding our most optimistic projections. I thought about all the future patients who would benefit from his research, all the families who would get to stay together because of medical advances that grew from his dedication to healing. That means more people will get to have what we have, I said. What do we have? James asked, reaching for my hand. I looked around our kitchen, at the photos of our travels together, the artwork David Jr. had made at school, the stack of thank you letters from patients and families, the research that would save lives scattered across our table. Everything, I said simply. We have absolutely everything. Later that evening, as we prepared for bed, James brought up something that had been on both our minds lately. Sarah, I've been thinking about retirement. At 75, he was still sharp and energetic, but the pace of directing a major research center was beginning to wear on both of us. We'd been talking about stepping back from administrative duties to focus on the parts of our work that brought us the most joy. What would we do? I asked, though I already knew the answer. Travel, right. Mentor young researchers and advocates. Spend more time with David Jr. Maybe take on some consulting work with developing cancer centers around the world. The idea was appealing. After decades of building programs and institutions, the prospect of returning to more personal, hands-on work felt like coming full circle. There's something else, James continued. I got a call from the Chen Foundation last week. They're opening a new global health initiative, and they want us to design their comprehensive care protocols. I stared at him. The Chen Foundation, the organization Marcus Chen had built, had become one of the world's most influential forces for innovative healthcare delivery. Working with them would be the perfect capstone to our careers. They specifically asked for us, I said. They specifically asked for us, I said. They said our model of turning personal experience into systematic change was exactly what they needed for their next phase of development. I smiled, thinking of that terrified woman who had sat alone in a cancer treatment center 50 years ago, never imagining that her abandonment would become the foundation for healing others around the world. The girl her father said would never make it had not only made it, she had helped millions of others make it too. The end.